In this section, we're going to go through upper body pushing. If you recall from the theory presentation, we can push horizontally or vertically. More importantly, though, we don't just have to press with two arms. We can also press with one arm, or we can alternate our arms. This is going to be supremely important because we want to engage the entire body when we press. By alternating our arms or utilizing one arm, we're going to introduce some rotational moments that are going to force our entire body to be involved in the press. This is going to go a long way to helping our shoulders be healthy and increase our pressing performance. The push-up, one of the most basic upper body pressing movements that you can do, and one that has always stood the test of time. And the reason why it stood the test of time is because it's not just an upper body pressing movement, it's a total body movement. When we get into upper body pressing, one of the main things we have to understand is that it's not just about upper body pressing. We have to incorporate the entire body for upper body pressing to truly be effective. And we're going to go through the push-up and some of the common mistakes that we're going to see, and then we're also going to focus on something else. That's going to be phases of contraction. When we think about phases of contraction, we think about the eccentric phase, the isometric phase, and the concentric phase. 9 times out of 10, when we're talking about repetitions, we're talking about what somebody can do in the concentric phase. We often ignore or neglect the other two phases. When we look at this push-up, we're actually going to think about a 3-position isometric hold. We're going to think about isometrically holding these positions to build strength where that strength is usually neglected. Key points we want to look at: shoulder and hand position, head position, and what's happening at the hips. JP is going to get into that push-up position, and again, we want to make sure that we're checking off these 3 main things. First thing before he starts, as he starts to lift up and we go into this 3-position hold, we want to make sure that there isn't a sag in this low back. Very, very common mistake that we're going to see is that people are going to start to lose their backs, and just like everything else we've been talking about, pillar strength is going to be fundamental to the execution and the performance of any movement that you do. We don't want to lose that focus or miss that focus here. Second thing, you can notice where his hand position is. Hand position and the elbows is going to dictate a lot as far as what we're training and what we're preparing for while we do this movement. It's very, very common for people to rotate their elbows outward, putting a lot of undue pressure on the shoulders. We do understand that in this upper body pressing movement, we want to place an emphasis both on the triceps and on the pecs. Therefore, we're going to want the elbows to be at about 45 degrees, being in line with the pecs. The hands are also going to screw into the ground, creating that tension, creating that pressure, and putting pre-tension so that we can get ready for that push. Last piece, head position. As we can see here, when he's flat, he's in a neutral position, creating that plumb line that we want to see. Again, this posture, if we were to stand him back upright, should not change. All we're doing is taking him from that upright position where his posture is perfect, putting him horizontal, and then making him work. As he starts, we're going to start to hold this position again, working and focusing on isometric strength. This shake that we see is what we want. This is communication. This is a relationship between the neuromuscular system, the nervous system, and the muscles starting to talk again. Often when we move dynamically and we move fast, we lose that communication. We want to reinvigorate that communication, reinvigorate that relationship to help build strength. That's why these isometric holds become very, very important when we start upper body pressing. We want to have to make the body account for rotational forces, initiating rotational strength. The easiest way for us to do this, an alternating dumbbell bench. JP is going to get set up and start executing this alternating dumbbell bench, and this is really the first progression in introducing a rotational element. When having both dumbbells up at the top, we've got our counterbalance. So as he gets set up, everything's going to be the same. We've got that counterbalance to be able to help set ourselves on this bench. But as he starts to execute this alternating press, by lowering one side and keeping the other side up, we start to introduce that rotational element. Now we've taken this up a notch where his body's going to have to work to stabilize. It's going to help to account for some of the dysfunctions that we see when either using a straight bar or pressing both arms at the same time. The alternating dumbbell bench is a great way to start introducing a rotational element to help account for total body strength in a pressing movement. There's one thing you're going to hear asked to you in the weight room. The question is going to be, how much do you bench? Who doesn't like bench pressing? If you've got shoulder pain, bets are you don't. And it's one of the key things that we see when people press. There are a lot of different ways that we can bench press, a lot of different variations, and we're going to utilize those to help correct some of the reasons why you probably don't like benching, and they're probably all associated with pain. Some of the key things that we're going to see that are going to aid in that pain that you feel when you bench press: rib flare, loss of control at the shoulder. Again, upper body pressing isn't just about the upper body. It's a total body movement. We're going to need the entire body to help us out to complete that press. What we're going to do now is what we call the half-off single-arm dumbbell bench press. By setting JP up in this half-off bench position, we're going to be able to capitalize on correcting some of those major imbalances that we're going to see that get away from us when we're benching flat on the bench. We're going to add in a rotational moment, taking him half off. It's going to have to make him focus on what he does at the shoulder. So when JP gets set up, first thing that you see is that he's set up far from the edge of the bench. This way, he has enough space to set his feet up so that his feet are flat, directly underneath his knees. So here, he's set up half off of the bench, so the entire right side of his body is off of the bench with only his left shoulder and his left glute touching the bench, splitting his head in half. We can already see that because he's half off, he's got this shoulder set. So as he starts to press, he's got this shoulder set with all of that resistance pressing on this side, demanding that he engage his torso, limiting rib flare. As we can see with this 45-degree angle at the shoulder as well, this elbow doesn't drop below the shoulder, and this is extremely important. What we usually see when people are set up on the bench, JP, you can relax. What we usually see when people are set up square on the bench is that they allow their elbows to drive back behind their shoulders. When this happens, there's going to be this anterior glide that happens at the shoulder, placing a lot of stress on the front side of that shoulder because the humerus is going to slide forward. We know that the biceps tendon is going to connect high on the humerus, which usually leads to a lot of pain, especially where the pec also inserts. This is usually why we feel a lot of anterior shoulder pain. By setting up half off of the bench, it's going to make us much more aware of where we're using our arms, how we're using our shoulders to be able to execute this press, and also engaging a lot of the other parts of the torso to help stabilize us, executing a more effective press. In the half-off bench position, JP had split his body completely in half. Left side of his body on the bench, right side of his body completely off. To progress this, we're going to go into a three-quarter position. Again, we were saying that this is a total body movement. We want to do what we can to make sure that we're incorporating the entire body as we press. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up at the back of the bench. When your clients get into this position, they may have trouble with the bench sliding just a little bit, so it's all right for you to get back here as your clients get into position. JP is also going to use his other hand to stabilize himself as he gets into this position, and as we can see, he's in what we call this tabletop position. Ankles directly underneath his knees, body's completely off the bench, just his left shoulder. What's great about this position is his glutes are now extremely active. They're making sure that there's no rotation taking place at the torso because now, in that single arm press position, his body is definitely going to want to rotate in order to stabilize what's happening. So now, this is a rotational strength movement plus an upper body pressing movement. Again, incorporating the entire body to help aid in the performance of this press. Upper body pressing, total body movement. In order to engage the torso, we want to start introducing a rotational element. We're talking about upper body pressing. And a couple of key things that we want to focus on when we talk about upper body pressing. First thing is going to be filling in the gaps. Our dumbbell variations helped us do just that. By utilizing the dumbbells, one arm, two arm alternating, we introduce a rotational element to help develop rotational strength. It's also going to teach us to use our entire body when we press. This is going to be very, very important for shoulder health. That's going to aid in our upper body pressing success. When we start talking about strength and power, we start talking about percentages, 40 to 60%, moving a bar dynamically, or upwards around 90% and above for developing maximal strength, nothing's going to beat the straight bar. The barbell bench for developing strength and power in the upper body will always be king. But there are key things that we want to focus on when we get underneath the bar. Getting underneath the bar is going to be the main thing that we want to do, and we want to do it correctly. First thing we want to focus on is our grip, the thumb, where the thumb is when we do this. If you have a full grip, that hook grip that we see in a lot of our Olympic weightlifting movements where that thumb is actually wrapped around the fingers, this is going to be a critical position because it's going to allow our wrist to stay locked. We talked about wrist position before, and that wrist position is supremely important. What we will see in other clients, though, and other athletes, is what we call a false grip, or that suicide grip. The problem with this is once the bar comes out, it's going to push that wrist into extension. We want to be able to keep our wrist in neutral and locked. We understand that we want to train our athletes and our clients out of this position, but if they bench in this position, it's something that we're going to have to work through. Position on the bar with the grip. The wider out our grip is going to be, the more of an emphasis there's going to be on the shoulders. The closer in our grip is going to be, the more their emphasis is going to be on our triceps. We want to be able to work on that tricep strength. Ultimately, a pressing movement is going to be a tricep-dominated movement. If you specifically want to work on the shoulders, you can take your grip out, But if we're thinking about benching success, again, if we're thinking about benching for maximal strength and power, we want to make sure that we're initiating tricep. We want to make sure that we're involving the triceps as much as possible. There's a good in between. A couple of landmarks on most benches where the knurling ends. The closer, the wider we are out on the rings, the more we're going to involve the shoulders. That happy medium is going to be right around in the center. Elbow flare. We want to make sure that the elbows are going to be in nice and tight when we bench, again, getting in that 45-degree plane, making sure that we're in line with the pecs. The wider out the elbows are, the more we're going to utilize the shoulders. JP's setup on the bench now. Head's in contact with the bench, hips in contact with the bench, feet are flat on the floor. Again, we're benching for strength and power, so stability is going to be critically important. This is not the time to put your feet up on the bench thinking that you're going to add in stability to make you better at benching. Again, we utilize our one-arm and two-arm alternating positions to execute that. We want to make sure that he's as stable as possible because, again, we're thinking about operating loads that are either going to be very, very heavy or we're going to want to move them very, very fast. This way, feet flat on the floor is going to be best for this. If your clients are too short, if because they're short they start to get an arch in that back, then bring in something where they can raise their feet. Create a new platform, but don't have them put their feet on the bench. We understand that they may get some rib flare if they're short, and that might put some undue pressure on their low back, and this is not what we want. But don't have them put their feet on the bench because that's going to make them less stable. And again, we're benching for ultimate power and strength here. Last thing is going to be the bar path. We're not talking about bar arc here. The shortest distance between 2 points is going to be a straight line. We want to make sure that we have a landmark, and that landmark is going to be right below the nipple line. So as JP gets set up and unracks this bar, he's going to make sure that he strikes the same point every time he benches. That bar is going to strike right in the center of his chest as he comes down, and we're going to see he's got his elbows in at about 45 degrees. That wrist is going to be right over the elbow, making sure that we're pressing a straight line. He's not going to press back over his eyes. He's pressing straight up with every rep. As the weight gets heavier and as we start to move this faster, it's going to be critical that this bar path never moves. Every rep is going to be like he's hitting an axe right into a piece of wood, carving that groove, making sure that we maximize the amount of strength and power that we can create as we barbell bench. The half-kneeling overhead press. When we think about upper body pressing, we understand that we're going to want to press in two different planes, the horizontal plane and the vertical plane. The vertical plane, to some degree, has been demonized. Overhead pressing has become something that we've sought to avoid, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's very, very healthy for the shoulders. It's also going to place a lot of rotational stress on the torso, which means that it's going to be a great way for us to be able to train rotational strength as well. We're going to really want to work on mobility and stability at the same time, much like everything else that we've done. So we're going to go into a half-kneeling position, placing the person in a position to be able to work on mobility and then also overhead press. There are a number of different ways that we can execute this overhead press, and there are a number of different implements that we can use. You can use a dumbbell, and you could also use a kettlebell. In this particular case, we're going to use a kettlebell, and we're going to go in the bottoms-up position. The reason why we're going to focus on the bottoms-up position is because we're going to want to lock that wrist. Locking the wrist is going to have a huge impact on how we set the shoulder and maintain the health of the shoulder as we go into an overhead press. A lot of times, there can be a sense of laziness either in the bottoms-down position with a kettlebell or with a dumbbell. This way, we definitely utilize setting the wrist, setting the shoulder, and then executing that overhead pressing movement the way that we want to. So as JP gets set up in this half-kneeling position, there are a few key points that we want to make note of. Again, the setup. Shoulders, hips, and knee in a line. We're going to add in the ear as well, making sure that the head is in the position that it needs to be, right? Everything in neutral. So now we've added that fourth point, the ear as well. On the front leg, we want to make sure that the ankle is as close to directly underneath the knee as possible. Differently from some of the other exercises that we've done, we want a true 90-90 position set up here. We can get into an aggressive acceleration position in some of our other movements, but for the most part, especially starting out before we advance, it's good to have this 90-90 setup. When we think about what's going to happen with the kettlebell, bottoms-up position. This bottoms-up position is going to lock in that wrist, again, helping to set the shoulder. It's also going to aid in making sure that he doesn't initiate the overhead press with his upper trap. It's very common for people to initiate that movement by hiking the upper trap. We want to make sure that that trap stays down, initiating with the lower trap as we press overhead. As JP does a couple of reps, we're going to see that there's a nice smooth movement as he presses this kettlebell up overhead. When he gets to the top, though, he's going to complete that movement with that subtle elevation, rounding everything out. The single arm setup is also going to place a lot of rotational demand on the entire system. So again, this is not just an upper body pressing movement. This becomes a total body pressing movement. We're working mobility, stability, rotational strength, overhead pressing strength the entire time. This is how we execute the half kneeling, one arm overhead press.